These people are hurt. How dare you use up all our grocery monies? What are we going to feed our kids with now? Many clients over the last 28 years that have lost literally hundreds of thousands of dollars, some clients millions, and they've lost all their properties, all their investments, their cars, everything, and they're left with literally nothing.
Hello and welcome to Wellbeing. I'm Jack Hodgins. Today I'll be discussing problem gambling recovery. We are joined by George Patriki, Director at the Gold Coast Addiction and Treatment Centre. George has been helping and assisting those with addiction issues since he himself exited the drug culture in 1983. He has been working in this field full-time as a dual diagnosis consultant since 1992. He is here today to share his expertise into gambling recovery. Hello, George, and welcome to the program.
Yeah, thank you, Jack, and thank you for your time and inviting me.
Is gambling an addiction? Why or why not?
Well, look, anything that becomes habitual will become an addiction, whether it's chemicals such as alcohol or other drugs, or gambling, or other behaviours. It could be sexual, shopping, workaholism, etc. In other words, as we repeat something, we wire it into the brain. So in the technical language, we call that neuroplasticity.
And you work for you're the founder of the Gold Coast Addiction and Treatment Centre. How did you come to be involved with that?
Well, about 38 years ago, I was battling with addiction, with alcohol, cannabis, stimulants like speed and the early forms of methamphetamine and heroin and really whatever I can get my hands on. So after about 7 years of that, nearly killing myself in the process, I went through the process of getting clean and going through about 10 years of therapy and working through those underlying issues. Then about 28 years ago, I had a heart to go back into the industry and got my qualifications, and since then I've been working 28 years as a therapist, as well as training organisations and government departments over the last 19 years.
And in your story, when did the Gold Coast Addiction and Treatment Centre come along? Was it an idea from the beginning, or was it gradually develop over time?
It actually evolved over time because I spent many years doing psychotherapy with clients one-on-one. And then about 8 years ago, I started doing consulting for another group that were providing intensive day treatment, and they also provided short-stay rehab interstate. And then I got the idea about 8 years ago to develop my own short-stay rehab centre that will provide what we call integrative holistic treatment. In other words, we bring together the four aspects of the human being that are involved in addictions: the biological, the psychological, the social and the spiritual, because they're all involved in all addictions. Therefore, they need to be there in the treatment process. So I wanted to develop a truly integrative program that can create what we call in the technical language sustainable recovery or sustainable solutions.
How prevalent is gambling addictions as far as your own treatment centre goes?
We have many people, and I've had many people with gambling addictions come to treatment that have lost everything, pretty much their income through losing their work, their house, their car, their family relationships, and they've had to sort of rebuild their life from scratch. You know, many people have come with hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of debts, prison sentences, incarcerations. Many people have resorted to criminal activity to sustain their habit. Often they'll have other substance abuse problems that go alongside with the gambling, particularly things like alcohol and cannabis and cocaine and methamphetamine. So they will be, if you like, partners with the gambling addiction, because once a gambling addiction takes hold of a person and they're using it to escape from reality and to feel that emptiness, they'll usually turn to other addictions as well to complement or to be like an adjunct or a partner to the gambling.
What is the optimal time for someone to seek help with their gambling addiction?
Well, as soon as a person says to themselves, "Oh, look, I'm not going to do this today," or I'm not going to gamble this week. I realise, I lost far too much last week and it's caused too many problems. That's it. I'm not doing it. And then they can't do it. They actually can't stop. As soon as a person comes to that realisation that, hey, I said I was going to stop, and I just realised I can't. That realisation, that awareness is telling them something's wrong. And once people are aware that something's wrong, really they need to put up their hand and get help. So the first level of help is what we would call just basic weekly counselling. And they go see a therapist, a psychologist, a counsellor to begin to look at what's the driving force here? Why are they doing this? And if they can't break the back of it, even with weekly counselling, then they need to get to level 2, which is what we call intensive day treatment that I talk about on my rehab the Gold Coast Addiction and Treatment Rehab. So the day treatment, essentially, I work with people from 9:30 to 3:30 every day for 20 days, Monday to Friday. That's intensive treatment. It's a complete rebuilding from the ground up, addressing all those underlying issues, shame and guilt and fear and anger and all those, human things that drive addictions. Now, if people are not in a safe environment, if they don't think that they can attend the day treatment without lapsing, then they're better off doing it in what we call our retreat, our short-stay rehab, where they get that intensive treatment, but they also get back to the treatment where they've got 24-hour supervision and they get all the adjunct allied health like massage, acupuncture and all those other things. So as you can see, it's a comprehensive treatment approach, and we also have expert doctors like Dr. David Jar's clinic in Robina that do all the biochemistry testing to make sure that we don't just do the basic emotional and psychological stuff, which is the obvious. We also look at the brain chemistry, because if people are deficient in things like B vitamins and zinc, for example, they can't actually make their brain chemistry. So in the technical language, we call them neurotransmitters. And most people know about serotonin that they talk about with depression as an example, right? But if we're not having the right neurotransmitters like zinc and vitamin B6, we can't actually convert tryptophan into serotonin. So that's going to become a problem for people's recovery. They're not going to manage their impulses, depression and anxiety and all the rest of it. So as you can see, we need to do both at the same time, the physical and the emotional and psychological and the social.
When it comes to gambling addiction, is it approaching it in recovery? Is it different to approaching, say, a drug addiction such as heroin, or are they pretty similar in their approach?
Yeah, so they're exactly the same, because all of them change the brain chemistry. When we do something repetitively, Dr. Norman Deutsch, in his book, The Brain That Changes Itself, explains that we build a protein in our brain neurons called delta phos-B. Through daily repetition, it reaches a certain level where it actually throws a genetic switch and physically changes the brain. So addiction is not just learned behaviour. It's not just the emotional, psychological. It does literally, physically change the brain structure and hijacks the reward system of the brain. So that's the first problem. The second problem is that all the normal things in our life that bring us fulfillment, or if you like, joy, or pleasure, if you like, we have brain chemistry for that. One of the most well-known, as you've probably heard, is dopamine, correct? Okay, so all of the normal things of life, we've got 10 things in our life, work, sex, food, relationships, going for a coffee with a friend. All of those things bring us pleasure because they release dopamine. And that's great. So we all get level 1 pleasure from 10 different things in our life. Great. So every time we get stressed, the brain says, don't worry, I can balance that stress because I've got 10 areas of pleasure to counterbalance the stress in my life. Everything's going fine. Unfortunately, we bump into a particular type of an addiction or a behaviour like gambling or chemicals, and instead of giving us the normal level 1, because we're vulnerable, maybe we lost our job, maybe we had an argument with our spouse, maybe one of our children have died, maybe some major crisis has happened, instead of giving us a level 1 pleasure response like we're supposed to get through the normal things of life, they give us what? Level 10. So what does the brain say? The brain says, far out. That's really good economics. That's great value for money. Why am I wasting my time with these 10 areas? I can just do this one thing and get level 10 of pleasure. Now, from the brain's perspective, you can see how attractive that is.
Oh, yeah.
So that's why it gets hold of us. It's good economics. So another part of our brain that learns these things, which is called glutamate, sees this program and says, I want it. Thank you very much. And that is what we call the addiction taking hold. So instead of getting pleasure at level 1 now, like we're supposed to, the bar gets raised to level 10. So it actually changes the pleasure level, or if you like, in the technical language, the hedonic levels are changed from level 1, which is what they're supposed to be, to level 10. Now, the only thing that gives us pleasure is what? The gambling, or the chemicals, or whatever that addiction is. So the normal things of life, what happens to those? They drop off the radar. And this is what you'll observe. This is what people see when people are caught up in addiction. The normal things drop off the radar. Why didn't you go to work? Why didn't you turn up for this appointment? What happened to coming to the birthday party, et cetera, et cetera? So all the normal things of life no longer have an appeal or a pleasure. So the brain does no longer a desire to drive those other things. It wants to focus on the good value for money behaviour that gives the brain level 10. That's what we mean by addiction.
You're listening to Wellbeing, where we're discussing problem gambling recovery. My guest today is George Patriki, Director of the Gold Coast Addiction and Treatment Centre. Can those changes that you mentioned in the brain be reversed in any way? Is that kind of where recovery comes in?
Actually, yeah, well said. So thank you. That's correct. So that's what we mean by recovery. We have to force the hedonic levels back down from level 10 to level 1. If you were to take a guess as to how we do that, how do you reckon we would do that?
Through therapy?
Yeah, good. So what the therapy does is that it rewires the brain and it retrains the brain. So as the brain was trained in the wrong way, the brain can be trained in the right way. But the only way to bring it down is through abstinence. So if a person has developed an addiction and then they're still using, say, once a week, going to gambling or using substances, do you reckon we'd bring down those hedonic levels?
Over a week, did you say?
If they're still doing it once a week. No, they won't. That's the problem. And this is why people get wrong advice, is some counsellors will say to them, oh, look, you're doing fantastic. You were doing it every day. Now you've gone down to once a week. It's okay now. This is controlled. No. They lost that window a long time ago. Even if they do it once a week, they will still maintain those pleasure levels at level 10 with the hedonic levels, and they won't change. So we say to people, the only way to reset the brain, and perhaps reset is a better word, is through abstinence. So it's absolutely necessary that people go through abstinence to rewire their brain. And once they've had that problem and they've trained the brain in a harmful way with the delta phos-B, then we say to people, you can't go back to this behaviour because the brain will pick up where it left off. So you need to be willing to go through a divorce with this behaviour. It has to be a permanent divorce and separation. It can't just be a part-time, oh, look, see you later, we just won't see each other for a while. It doesn't work like that. If people have developed a genuine addiction, which is different to problematic behaviour. So in other words, on my videos on my website, on the services page, I have the Cycle of Addiction video. It goes for about 30 minutes, which explains this harm with addiction. And I explain that level 3 addiction, which is called harmful dependency or harmful use, okay, people can still get on top of things. That's different than addiction, where this behaviour has actually taken over our life. If we've actually gotten to level 4 addiction, then that's it. We can't go back to controlled use. And this is the problem that people make. Because as soon as something goes wrong, they might be clean for 6 months, 2 years from gambling and substances. All of a sudden someone dies or they go bankrupt, and what does the brain say? Oh, don't worry, I know what to do. The brain remembers, and it goes back to that behaviour. I have the solution, don't worry. And the glutamate never forgets. That's why people can lapse even years later. And that's why we say to people, let go of this fantasy of controlled use. That's gone. Once you've developed a true addiction, you can't go back. It's finished.
Would you say in a lot of ways that when people come to see you at your treatment centre, are there different degrees, you mentioned the levels there, are there different degrees of an addiction or of problematic behaviour?
Absolutely. There is level 3 called harmful use, where people find things are starting to go wrong, but they still are able to maintain some level of functioning in their life. But they know that there's a problem there, and it can go all the way to the full-blown addiction where a person has lost absolutely everything. Yeah, that you can sort of almost visibly see the addiction in them because they're no longer looking after themselves, the way that they dress, they're not eating, they're not sleeping. You can basically tell by the way that they present themselves that they're actually out of control. You can see it in their persona, not just in their psychosocial functioning. So that's what we mean by level 4. But it definitely starts from level 3, where people start to lose control and they know that something's wrong.
What's level 1 and 2?
Level 1 is just what we call experimentation. A person bumps into something and it gives them pleasure. There's no problems there. A person does not acknowledge that there's a problem. They just stumble across something that gives them pleasure. Level 2 is what they call social and recreational use. A person has a weekly pattern and they don't believe or see that there's any risk or harm associated with their substance use or with their gambling. But once it gets to level 3, harmful use, they already by that stage can see something's wrong. And that's usually when they start putting up their hand, oh, shit, I better talk to someone, or maybe I better go for some counselling, or well, maybe I should go to the 12-step programs, or they start to get insight that something's not right. And it grows from level 3 all the way to level 4, where they totally lose control of everything.
Is it hard to ask for that help?
Often there's a barrier, and there's many barriers to overcome. There is financial barriers where some people get themselves in such a mess financially they can't even afford the gap between what Medicare gives them with a psychologist and the gap that they need to pay. Occasionally, they might bump into free services, which really helps that demographic or that group of people. But most people really will have finances as a barrier, and the natural stigma that I've got a problem and I've got to put up my hand. And as you can imagine, the most popular stigma would be I'm weak, I'm deficient, there's something wrong with me. In other words, shame. So they already feel shame about what they've been doing to themselves. They already feel shame about harming people that they love, including themselves. And then to put up their hands will mean to acknowledge this harm. And that's humiliating, and it is a very important barrier that they must overcome. That's why support is so important, and removing that stigma and that barrier.
And you mentioned the financial troubles there, and especially around gambling. I can imagine that would come up a lot for those affected by a gambling addiction.
Absolutely. It's not unusual. I've had many clients over the last 28 years that have lost literally hundreds of thousands of dollars, some clients millions, and have lost all their properties, all their investments, their cars, everything, and they're left with literally nothing.
Because when they don't have the money, what are some solutions to how they can get help?
Okay, sometimes you'll find that there are 12-step programs like Gamblers Anonymous, and just like you've got Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous, you also have Gamblers Anonymous. Through the gambling hotline, they can help a person get in touch with gambling services where sometimes they could even get free counselling. So they don't just have to get private counselling through a psychologist. Sometimes they can access established services that do provide gambling for free, gambling services and gambling counselling.
What is the attitude that someone needs to have when they're undertaking recovery?
I often say to my clients, one of the dilemmas we have to overcome is believing that we can live in this world without suffering. While we continue to hold on to this fantasy and this illusion, it'll always set us up for addiction and we'll never recover. So the first step in recovery is to acknowledge that we're going to suffer doing treatment, but we'll also suffer not doing treatment. Either way, we're going to suffer. We might as well suffer doing the treatment and have something to show for it. You've spent time, money and energy getting addicted over the last X amount of months or years. It'll take time, money and energy to get well. Are you willing to pay the price? Are you willing to invest? Are you willing to commit to your recovery, yes or no? And that's one of the first questions a person has to ask themselves.
Are the challenges different in recovery, say, between someone with a gambling addiction and someone with a heroin addiction or any kind of, substance like that? Because I could imagine that when it's with gambling, you don't get physical withdrawals. Are there differences between those things?
You might find some physical differences in the body when it comes to something like heroin, because you can actually physically see and physically feel the withdrawals with diarrhea and vomiting and those kinds of things, nausea, etc. Whereas gambling, you might not necessarily see the physical withdrawals, but the brain does actually go through withdrawals because, remember, we've changed those hedonic levels and the brain is physically desiring and wanting that brain chemistry. It wants that pleasure. It needs it because that's how the brain is designed to operate. If we don't give it, there's going to be a withdrawal and people are going to find themselves driven or pulled back into this addictive behaviour to get that pleasure. That's why they need to be absolutely vigilant with their recovery and have really good supports in place to rebuild their relationships with family and friends and work and hobbies and interests. And you can imagine how hard that is when they're doing all the hard work, but they're not getting the pleasure because the brain chemistry still hasn't been repaired. Imagine a person, they've stopped their behaviour like gambling or chemicals, and they're in recovery, but they're still not getting pleasure because they haven't rebuilt their brain chemistry. And I think, stuff this for a joke. I'm doing all this hard work, but I'm not feeling the benefits. That's why recovery can be really difficult for them because they're not feeling the benefits. They're doing the work, they're not feeling the benefits. So therefore they have to be patient to rebuild the chemistry. That is why it's absolutely essential that they also do the brain chemistry recovery with zinc and B vitamins and magnesium and all those nutrients, omega-3 like krill oil for the brain and vitamin D from the sun and exercise. And this is all part of the solution. It's all part of the therapy. It's not an optional extra.
You're listening to Wellbeing, where we're discussing problem gambling recovery. My guest today is George Patriki, Director of the Gold Coast Addiction and Treatment Centre. What is the environment that needs to be curated for those that are undertaking the recovery?
Well, a supportive environment, because the last thing a person needs is shame and guilt. They're already battling shame and guilt. Shame and guilt is often a major precursor, or if you like, driving force in the background that pushes people into escape-type behaviour, such as gambling and chemicals. So naturally, if they're getting condemnation, like the Three Amigos, that funny comedy you might remember with Chevy Chase and Martin Short and Steve Martin, you scum-sucking pig, you son of a motherless goat. So if people are feeling that kind of stuff or hearing that kind of language from people, that's going to drive them further into the addiction. They don't need shame and condemnation. They're already struggling with that. They need support and recovery. That doesn't mean we condone their behaviour at all. It doesn't mean we don't have any boundaries when we're in a relationship with them. Quite the opposite. The boundaries need to be very firm. Hey, mate, you can't have your addiction and your marriage at the same time. You can't have your addiction and your parenting. You can't have your addiction and health. You've got to choose what's more important to you, your addiction or those other 10 departments of your life. What's it going to be? You can't have both. And people fight tooth and nail. They fight to the death to actually have both. And that's why they often lapse, because they secretly believe in their hearts that they can have their addiction and still maintain their job and parenting and marriage, etc., etc., etc.
Is it possible for family members and friends to effectively help someone that has a gambling issue?
Absolutely. And that's why we have family supports in place. You'll notice on my website, actually, I have a whole page devoted to family support for that very reason, that I draw the family into the recovery process. So those videos that are on my website that I ask clients to watch, I also ask their loved ones to watch them too. Why? So we're all speaking the same language, that we're all working from the same page, and we're all working on an agreement. So the person who's struggling with an addiction like gambling or chemicals agrees with their loved ones who are involved in the process as to what recovery looks like, what their commitment is, what their role is, what the boundaries are. So it needs to be a total systematic approach where the families and the person with the addiction are working together in agreement.
What are some of the strategies that families can have to help a partner or somebody that close to them that does have a gambling addiction?
Well, the first thing is for a person to say, look, I love you, but I'm not putting up with this behaviour. You've sacrificed our income, 2 weeks in a row. Now we can't buy our groceries, et cetera. Sorry, I'm not putting up with that. I love you, but I'm not putting up with that. So you want that behaviour, you're going to have to do it on your own. But I won't live with you if you intend on bringing that harm to yourself. I don't want to live with that. So you choose what's more important to you. I love you, but I'm not putting up with that behaviour. In other words, I love the person, I hate the behaviour. It must be a very strong message with family and friends. I love you, but I hate the behaviour. I will not put up with it. You choose what's more important to you, but I won't live with this. If you want that harm, that's your choice. I don't want the harm. You can have it if you want, but I won't live with that harm.
Is gambling addiction something that's ever really cured after recovery, or does it need ongoing management and strategies?
Well, it's cured in the sense that I choose not to do it anymore. That's what we mean by cured. I no longer desire this. I believe I can live a healthy, fulfilled and happy life without this addiction, without the gambling or chemicals. So that's the realisation that a person must come to, and they do. When they do treatment, that's one of the things that they realise in the treatment process. They no longer need this addiction to live a fulfilled and happy life. They no longer care about it. They find those 10 areas of their life, work and relationships and hobbies and friends and activities and, civil, responsibility and the spirituality and all those important parts of the jigsaw puzzle bring them joy and fulfillment and happiness. They don't need the addiction.
How long does the recovery process usually last?
Well, again, how long is a piece of string? Every person's an individual, as you can imagine. Sometimes people will need to be doing the recovery for the rest of their lives if they've done some serious damage to their brain chemistry and their brain structure. That's why we have what we call in the technical language the tripod of support. So when they have done the short stay rehab with us, which is 28 days, then for the next 12 months, they commit vigilantly to the tripod, which is weekly counselling, weekly meetings and weekly sponsors. So they have 3 contacts a week. And then perhaps maybe after the first few months when it's weekly, they might negotiate with their sponsor, with their counsellor, that they really feel strong and stable and fortnightly sufficient. But usually I suggest weekly for the first 12 months, and then they can negotiate that. So that might need to happen for the rest of their lives. It might just need to happen for a few years. Everyone's an individual. Everyone's different. But the idea is when they have a tripod of support package, they're not alone. They negotiate that, and it's not just a hope for the best. So it's not a kind of a hope for the best recovery. It's a clearly planned, sustained recovery, if that makes sense.
How well does society, in its current understanding upon addiction, understand addiction?
Well, it's slightly changing. I mean, every 5 or 10 years, as society gets more education and information and media coverage, and even just what we're doing right now, the people that are listening are able to get a little bit more awareness and insight. It's not just I'm a bad person. And a lot of people think that the person with the addiction, like gambling or chemicals, is a bad person. They just don't care about me. They don't care about anyone but themselves. You know, that not caring has happened as a result of a process of deterioration where the brain's reward system has been hijacked. And the reason why they don't care is because the addiction has reached the number 1 position over a period of time. But they didn't start off like that. It might take months or even years for a person to get to that level. So they're not a bad person. They're a good person making bad choices. So the underlying message in our treatment program from day one is always, you're a beautiful individual masterpiece, but you've made some bad choices. Welcome to the real world. Who hasn't? You can't recover until you value your life. So it's about learning that you are valuable and important. You deserve a good life. Yes, you've made bad choices. So have I. Who hasn't?
I think those are some really important points then. I think, especially in saying that some of the choices may not have been good, but that doesn't necessarily mean the person is bad. And I guess where I'm going with this question is that, is it hard in some ways to communicate that to the family members that may have been hurt by those bad decisions?
As you can imagine, I think you've already said it beautifully. These people are angry. These people are hurt. How dare you? You use up all our grocery monies. What are we going to feed our kids with now? You go to the Salvation Army and get help. They're hurt and they're angry about this person, looking after number 1 and neglecting their loved ones and their work and et cetera, et cetera. So they're really deeply hurt. They feel betrayed. So I often explain to people when they're in this addiction, you've got to understand this betrayal to your loved one is no different than having an affair. Sure, it might be an electronic vagina or penis rather than a physical one, but the betrayal and the behaviour is exactly the same. Do you understand why your loved one is angry with you? It's the same secrecy, the same lies, the same deception, the same narcissism and self-absorbed behaviour. Do you understand why they're angry with you? And they usually get it when I explain all that. So you're not a bad person, but this negative behaviour has brought harm not only to you, but to people around you. They need time to heal. And that's why earlier when you brought up the importance of family intervention, it was a good question that you brought up, because that's why. Because sure, this person might be in treatment, but what about the family? They're not in treatment. And if they're not catching up with the treatment process, they might be angry for 10 years because no one's helping them get out of and get unstuck from their angry position. So we need to be working with both. We need to work from a systemic framework so that the individual and their loved ones are in recovery.
What would be the take-home from this interview you'd want people to remember the most?
Dealing with all addictions like gambling and chemicals is really a society response, We all need to take responsibility to create a society where people can get well and provide the infrastructure and the resources and the supports. So we all have a role to play to create the recovery programs and the counselling and the education, so people do not moralise the person struggling with addiction and condemn them. You're a bad person, you deserve to be hung, you're an evil person. No one gets better in that kind of a culture and environment. People need love and understanding, but those boundaries have to be super clear. I love you, but I will not put up with that negative behaviour and harm. So we need to educate people about how to build those kind of healthy boundaries. And I always encourage people to read that wonderful book by Dr. Cloud and Dr. Townsend called Boundaries. And they've written many, many books about boundaries in many aspects of life, whether it's boundaries in work or boundaries in parenting or boundaries in marriage, or their first book called just plain Boundaries. So boundaries are what? Invisible fences of love. In other words, boundaries are the rules of engagement by how we live life. They are the principles of love that drive our relationships. So that's what society needs to learn. And because we're all involved in the problem, therefore we all need to be in there in the solution.
It was a pleasure talking with you today, George.
Thank you. It's been lovely to talk with you. And naturally, if people want further information, they can go to my website, the Gold Coast Addiction and Treatment Rehab.com. And there's a whole lot of education there, especially on the services page where the videos are. So people are welcome to access those for free and educate themselves and become a support to those around them.
My guest today was George Patriki, Director of the Gold Coast Addiction and Treatment Centre. Thank you for listening. I'm Jack Hodgins, and all of us at Wellbeing wish you well.